The river didn't ask questions. It didn't care who she used to be or what she had lost. It didn't care that her dress was torn or that her shoes had come apart 10 miles back. It didn't even care that she'd stopped crying. The current only cared that she kept moving forward, that she had come willingly, that she wanted to disappear. Eliza stepped into the water like it was a church, arms slack at her sides, chin up, breath tight. The cold gripped her ankles first, then her knees, her hips. The wind bit her spine, but she didn't flinch. She looked up once into the empty gray sky and mouthed something. Not a prayer, not a name, just enough. And then the river pulled. The cold hit first, not the shock of it. She'd braced for that, but the way it clawed its way up her chest like a hand closing around her ribs. Eliza didn't struggle. She let the current tilt her backward, let her legs drift weightless beneath her. Her hair floated around her head like moss. Her eyes stayed open. She'd heard drowning was quiet, but she hadn't expected it to feel like surrender. Then, a jerk, not the water. A rope wrapped around her wrist, pulling hard. She twisted, kicked once out of instinct, then froze as she was yanked upward. Her chest burned. Her fingers clawed at the water. Above the surface, the gray sky exploded into view. Her lungs convulsed. She gasped, a raw, rattling drag of breath, and choked on air. On the muddy bank, a figure leaned back, hands braced in the earth, arms taut with effort. A man, soaked to the elbows, his skin the color of rain-dark stone, black hair braided and clinging to his jaw. He didn't say a word. He just pulled. She hit the mud with a hollow sound, coughing water and bile. Her chest ached. Her arms shook, but her eyes locked on him. "Why?" she rasped. The man crouched in silence, watching her without expression. His eyes were wide and still, like he was seeing a ghost and didn't trust it to stay. Eliza tried to sit up. Her muscles refused. She reached for the knot at her wrist and pulled. It held. "Untie me," she croaked. He didn't move. She tried again, voice rougher. "Untie me." Nothing. She wanted to scream, to claw at him, to make him understand she hadn't asked for rescue, that he'd undone something she could never rebuild. But her body betrayed her. Her head lolled forward, her breath rattling against her ribs. And still, he didn't speak. He carried her, slung her across his back like a sack of grain, one arm around her knees, the other clutching the rope still tied to her wrist. Her consciousness faded in and out. Flashes of shadow and pine, the smell of smoke and wet bark, the crunch of snowless earth under boots. By the time she woke fully, she was on a bed of pine boughs beside a low fire, a blanket draped clumsily over her. The rope was still there, still tied, but now the other end was coiled beside the man's boot. He sat with his back to her, long legs stretched toward the heat, head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Eliza lay still for a long time, unsure whether she was angry or just alive. The second time she spoke, her voice was stronger. "You shouldn't have done that." The man didn't turn. "You had no right," she said louder. "I didn't want to be saved." He didn't look at her, didn't answer. Just reached forward, adjusted the fire, and sat back again. "I had a reason," she said, as if that would explain it all, as if reasons mattered to people like him. Still silence. Eliza sat up slowly, her joints crackling. The blanket slipped off her shoulders. Her dress was stiff with dried mud and river stink. She tugged at the rope again. It didn't bite her wrist. He'd been careful. "Are you mute?" No answer. "Stupid?" Nothing. She sighed, long and shaking, then fell back onto her elbow and stared at the stars beyond the canopy. "I hope you have a reason too." She dreamed of water. Not drowning, not quite, just the feel of it against her skin, the way it swallowed sound, the way it made everything slower. In the dream, she reached for someone's hand and missed. When she woke, the rope was gone. So was the man. She bolted upright, half expecting him to have disappeared, some phantom sent by regret. But his pack was still there. The coals were warm. And not 30 yards away, the man stood in the river again, waist deep, casting a line into the slow-moving current. Fishing, like saving her, had been just a chore, something to check off before breakfast. Eliza blinked hard. Then she laughed. Just once. But it hurt. They walked without speaking. Not out of anger, though there was still plenty of that, but because there was nothing to say. He never asked her name. She never asked his. He handed her food when they stopped. Simple things, dried meat, wild greens, once even a handful of berries she wasn't sure were safe. He always ate half first. She always ate the rest. At night, he made the fire, gave her his blanket, slept on the other side. The rope stayed between them, not tied, but there, like a question neither of them had the nerve to ask. Days passed. 5, maybe 6. Time got slippery out here. Eliza's hair dried in a wild halo. Her voice came back. So did her anger. You ever going to tell me why? She asked it one morning, crouched beside the fire while he sharpened a blade with rhythmic care. The man paused. Then, finally, he looked up. Neto, he said. Eliza frowned. Your name? He nodded. She waited. When nothing else came, she nodded back. Eliza. That night she wandered a few steps from camp and found a place to sit where the trees broke open to a low ridge. Below, the world stretched wide and tired. Nothing moved but the wind. She thought about her mother, her sister, the man who'd lied, the ones who watched, and the ones who didn't. Neto came to stand behind her. Close, but not too close. She didn't look at him. I went into that river on purpose, she said. He didn't reply. She didn't expect him to, but he sat beside her, not touching, not pressing, just staying. She didn't know what she wanted anymore, but she knew what she didn't want. To be alone, to be owned, to be saved with expectations. Neto offered none of those. Only silence, fire, and the rope, which he no longer tied. Still, every night she coiled it between them, just in case. Eliza didn't sleep that night, not because of nightmares. Those had dulled weeks ago into a kind of silent hum beneath her thoughts, but because silence itself had become too loud. Neto lay not 5 feet away, a shadow in the firelight, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of someone unbothered by ghosts. She hated that about him, that stillness, that calm, that damn rope he no longer touched, as if he knew she wouldn't run, as if she'd already decided to stay. She hadn't, not really. By dawn, she had made her decision. They were on flat ground now, less forest, more open sky. That made it harder to disappear, but easier to breathe. She packed quietly like he did, a twist of dried meat, her blanket folded tight, the canteen tucked behind her belt. Neto didn't speak. He never did in the morning, just nodded once when she stood and set off behind him. The trail was nothing, just a suggestion between thorn bush and dry scrub. She didn't ask where they were going. She never had. He never offered. But she wasn't planning to go anywhere with him today. She waited until midday, waited until they passed an abandoned wagon rotting beside a creek bed, waited until the hills curved just enough to block his sightline. Then she turned, fast and quiet, and ran. It wasn't graceful. Her boots weren't meant for speed. Her legs were stiff, uncooperative. But she ran anyway, teeth clenched, breath shallow. A bird startled overhead. A thorn snagged her dress. Still, she didn't stop. Not until her chest heaved and her thighs burned, and the wind whipped dust into her eyes. She glanced back. Empty trail. No sound of pursuit. No rope. No shadow moving through the brush. That hurt more than she'd expected. She found shelter in the rocks. A low rise with just enough overhang to crawl under. She waited there, knees to chest, arms wrapped tight, listening. Nothing. No boots. No voice. No Neto. She told herself that was good, that it proved she was free, that this time she'd choose what came next. And yet, she waited. For hours. When night came, it came fast. Cold poured in like spilled ink. She had no fire, no food, no rope between her and the dark. But she stayed there anyway. It wasn't pride, it was shame. For hoping he'd follow, for being angry when he didn't. The morning sun woke her before she was ready. Her limbs ached. Her lips cracked. She drank the last of the water and stood stiffly, brushing the dirt from her hair. Then she saw it, on the stone near her foot, a piece of flint, not dropped, placed, a mark. He'd been here. She turned slowly, and there he was, 20 paces away, sitting cross-legged on a boulder like he'd been waiting all night. Not angry, not smug, just present. Eliza stared at him, heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" she asked. No answer. "You think I owe you something because you pulled me out of that river?" Still nothing. "You don't get to keep me." She stepped forward, jaw set. "I didn't ask for your rope, or your fire, or your silence." Wianeto stood, not fast, not threatening, but it was enough. She balled her fists. "I'm not broken," she said. He nodded. "I don't need saving." Another nod. "I—" Her voice cracked. Her shoulders sagged. "I don't know what I'm doing." He didn't move. She sat down on the ground. Neither did he. They spent the rest of the day in silence. Not tense, not anymore. Just real. Two people with no map. That night she spoke again. "You always live like this?" He tilted his head slightly. "In the woods. Alone." He nodded once. "Why?" He looked up at the stars. Then softly he said, "Because no one listens when I speak." It was the first full sentence he'd said since they met. Eliza blinked. And then she laughed. Not cruel, not loud, just surprised. "Well," she said, "that makes two of us." The next morning they walked side by side. Not because they had to, because they chose to. Late that afternoon they found an old miner's cabin, half buried in the earth, the door barely hanging, moss thick along the walls. Eliza stepped inside first, hand on her knife. Empty, dusty, quiet. She turned back. "We could stay here, for a while." Wianeto looked at her, unreadable. Then he nodded. That night she lit the fire. He sat on the floor, back against the far wall, legs stretched out. She tossed him a canteen. He caught it one-handed. "I used to be married," she said. Wianeto didn't react. "I thought it meant something, but to him I was just a name to write on land deeds." She stared at the flames. "He hit me once, then said I made him do it. Said I was lucky he stayed." Still he didn't speak. "But I stayed anyway, until I couldn't anymore." She looked up. "Now you know." He didn't flinch, didn't offer comfort, didn't try to fix her. Just said, "You stayed alive." She didn't cry. She thought she might, but she didn't. Instead, she moved closer to the fire and sat beside him. The cabin didn't care where they came from. Its door leaned like a tired shoulder. Its walls sagged in silence. But it held. That was all Eliza needed. The first night inside, she swept the dirt out with a pine branch. The second, she lined the walls with old feed sacks to keep the wind from gnawing straight through. By the third, she'd found a rhythm, silent, deliberate, and oddly satisfying. Wianeto never offered instructions. He repaired the door, fitted stones under the sagging corners, hunted enough to keep the fire fed and their stomachs from hollowing out completely. But he never said stay. He didn't have to. She already had. The nights were still cold. Even with the fire and the blanket and the cracked glass windows stuffed with wool, Eliza still shivered. But it was the kind of cold she could work with, the honest kind, the kind you could fight with a second layer and a tight grip on your own breath. The other kind, the one that sank in through memory or absence or the sound of your own name said wrong, was finally beginning to fade. Wianeto didn't talk about her river. He didn't talk about his own. But Eliza could tell he had one. Everyone did. By the end of the first week, she no longer coiled the rope between them at night. It had become unnecessary. He wasn't watching her for signs of flight anymore, and she wasn't looking for a reason to leave. One morning, she found him outside before sunrise, barefoot in the frost, staring into the woods. "Dream?" she asked. He didn't look at her, just answered, "Noise." She nodded, unsure if he meant a sound in the trees or in his head. Maybe both. He stayed out there a while. She went back in and brewed chicory root in a dented tin mug. When he came inside, hands red from the cold, she handed it to him without a word. He sipped once, then softly, "Thank you." It wasn't the first word he'd spoken, but it was the first one that felt like it was meant for her. They never talked about the day she ran, never talked about the man she'd left behind. But one evening she traced a line in the dust with a broken stick and said, "My father had hands like yours. Quiet hands. Strong." Wianeto didn't respond, but he watched the line she drew with sharp attention. Eliza didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. It was enough that he didn't flinch at the word father. The cabin became a pattern, not a prison. They fell into habits. He sharpened tools in the morning. She gathered roots and dried herbs in the afternoon. They fixed what they could, left the rest to the wind. Sometimes Wianeto disappeared for a day, never longer. Eliza never asked where he went, but he always came back. And when he did, he brought something. A rabbit, a small satchel of dried tobacco. Once a carved piece of wood with her initials burned into it. She didn't cry, but she didn't let go of it either. They didn't touch, not because of fear, not even shame, but because the space between them was still sacred, still soft, still becoming. Wianeto never asked what had happened to her wedding ring. Eliza never asked what he saw when he stared into the fire for hours. But when he sat beside her and handed her the last piece of meat, she took it. And when he stayed up all night to guard against a howling wind that rattled the cabin like bones in a tin cup, she moved her bedroll closer, just enough that their shoulders almost touched. One day, while sorting through a rotted trunk in the back corner of the cabin, she found a yellowing book, half eaten by mice. The spine cracked when she opened it. Inside, someone had scrawled Annabelle 1872 in tight cursive. Eliza read the name aloud. Wianeto looked up from carving kindling. "Your mother?" he asked. Eliza shook her head. "Not mine." She turned a few pages, stared at the brittle paper. Most of the words were gone, but some sentences remained. "God does not see as man sees." She read it twice, then closed the book and tucked it into her satchel. That night, the firelight caught her differently. Wianeto stared at her for a long time, then said, "You don't cry in your sleep anymore." She didn't realize she had, but she believed him. The next morning, she opened the cabin door and smelled snow. It hadn't fallen yet, but it was close. She turned to him and said, "We'll need more wood." He nodded, already pulling on his boots. And that was the first time she thought, maybe we'll be here through winter. And it didn't scare her. One night, the silence broke. Wianeto stood suddenly at the door, knife in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Eliza froze. "What is it?" He raised one hand. "Stay." She waited by the fire, every muscle stiff, her breath barely moving. He stepped outside. Moments passed, a full minute, then another. Then, a thud and a cry. Wianeto came back with a limp fox in his hand, bloodied and still twitching. It had been tangled in the snare behind the cabin. He'd heard it from inside. Eliza watched as he knelt beside the fire and whispered something in Lakota over the body before finishing the kill. Then he looked up at her and said, "You're safe." She nodded, and for the first time she believed it. Later, as she folded herself into the bedroll, she whispered, "My husband wouldn't have heard that." Wianeto looked at her, eyes half-lidded. "My husband would have slept through it." Still silence. "My husband wouldn't have come back." Then softer. "But you did." He didn't speak, but he reached across the space between them, not to touch, just to rest his hand on the floor beside hers. Close. Enough. The days grew shorter. Sunlight bled out faster now, leaking through the gray sky like something ashamed of itself. The trees outside the cabin had stiffened, branches brittle with frost, needles silvered by breathless air. Inside, Eliza moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She cleaned, cooked, organized the space like it was hers, because in small, wordless ways it had become just that. Wianeto never stopped her, never interfered. But he watched. She caught him sometimes, eyes following the movement of her hands as she folded cloth or stitched up the split seams of a coat she didn't remember agreeing to fix. "Stop looking at me like that," she muttered once, eyes down. He only blinked, slow and silent, like maybe he didn't know he was staring. She didn't like debt, not in coin, not in favors, not in breath still ticking through her lungs, because someone else had pulled her from the river and refused to let her drown. She owed him, and Eliza Harper did not like owing anyone anything. So she tried to pay him back. It started with small things. She dried roots into tea bundles, wrapped in bits of cloth and left on the shelf. She cleaned his knife after he returned from a hunt, sharpened it once just to see if she still could. She carved a handle for his kettle. He didn't thank her, but he didn't replace it either. One morning she tried to cut more firewood than he had the night before. She nearly split her hand open. Wianato said nothing, just watched her bandage it herself. The next day the axe was gone from its place on the porch. When she looked up, she saw it buried in a clean row of logs. More than she could have chopped in a week. He'd done it quietly, so she wouldn't try again. She hated him for that, and loved him a little too. She offered to cook the rabbit. He shook his head. Offered to mend the hole in his coat. He turned away. Offered to help him set snares. He didn't stop her, but he also didn't show her how. So she watched, and learned, and did it anyway. One night, she put the last of the jerky into his hands and told him to eat it. He hesitated. "Eliza," he said quietly. She stiffened. He rarely used her name. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I know. I'm not yours. I know. Then why won't you let me?" "Because it isn't about you owing me," he said. She stared at him. He stared at the fire. And that was the end of it, except it wasn't, because she kept trying. Not because he expected it, but because she needed it. She needed to reclaim the space between them as something more than survival. She began to sing softly while she worked, half melodies with no name, drifting out like breath. Wianato never asked where the songs came from, and Eliza never told him. But she caught him once, tapping his thumb against his knee in time, and that was enough. The cabin was not romantic. It leaked. It creaked. It smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke, and too many boots dried too close to the fire. But it was safe, and safety, real safety, was its own kind of intimacy, more honest than any kiss, more lasting than 1,000 empty "I love yous." One evening she found a small box tucked under the floorboards. Inside, buttons, a bent spoon, and a bone comb cracked down the center. She held it in her hands for a long time. Then she repaired it, cleaned it, left it on his side of the shelf. Winter fell hard. Snow came without warning, thick and punishing. For 3 days they were sealed in by drifts that buried the front step and muffled the entire world. They sat close by the fire, wrapped in the same blanket. Neither mentioned it. Eliza fell asleep one night with her head tilted against his shoulder. She woke there too. On the 4th day, the wind died down. Wianato opened the door and dug a path with slow, rhythmic care. Eliza watched from the doorway. "You're not used to being helped," he said without turning. "No," she replied. "I'm not used to it being real." He paused. Then, "It is." She didn't answer, but she stayed beside him, knee-deep in snow, throwing shovelfuls into the cold wind. And for once, they dug out together. She asked about his family once. He said nothing, just tapped 2 fingers against his chest. It wasn't anger. It was grief, old and deep. She never asked again, but she started cooking enough for 2 with leftovers. Not because they needed it, but because someone once taught her it was polite to feed the dead. One morning, Wianato brought back a bird with a broken wing. A little thing, not worth the meat. Eliza took it anyway, wrapped the wing in cloth, made a space in the corner near the stove. It healed. When she let it go, it stayed on the windowsill until dusk, then vanished. She watched it disappear against the sky. Wianato watched her. "You fixed it," he said. "No," she replied. "I just gave it time." On the first day of the new year, she woke up before him, stared at the ceiling for a long time, tracing the shape of a crack above her bedroll. She sat up slowly, stretched her legs, and looked over at the man who had once pulled her out of the river. He looked younger when he slept, softer. Less like the man who had once tied a rope to her wrist. More like the one who had left it untied every night after. She didn't touch him, but she sat beside him and whispered, "Thank you." Just once. Then got up and made coffee. That night, as they sat in the quiet between crackling logs and shifting dreams, she finally said it. "You saved my life." He didn't look at her. You saved mine, he said. The days began to stretch again. The ice retreated from the edges of the roof, dripping like a clock relearning how to count. Trees that had bowed under snow now stood straighter. Birds returned in cautious pairs. But inside the cabin, time moved differently. It didn't tick. It breathed. Eliza no longer marked the days on the wall with charcoal, not because she'd forgotten, but because she no longer needed to count her distance from the past. She was building something now, even if she didn't have a name for it. They still hadn't touched, not fully. Their hands had brushed once, accidentally, when reaching for the same tin cup, and he had rested his coat over her shoulders once, after a particularly wet hunt. But beyond that, they hovered, close enough to feel the heat, careful enough not to disturb the shape of what was forming between them. There was a kind of reverence in it, not fear, not hesitation, just grace. Wianeto had carved a second stool from a fallen cedar, left it beside the fire. Eliza found it one evening and didn't ask, just sat. Later that night, he handed her a small wooden comb, better than the broken one she'd repaired. She turned it in her hand. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Simple. And that was the moment she knew. He didn't save her because he was good. He saved her because he chose to be. They didn't speak of the future, but they began to prepare for one anyway. She mended the roof with flattened tins. He started gathering extra wood again, even though spring was peeking through the hills. She planted herbs in broken teacups. He cleaned a second rifle, not because they expected trouble, but because they understood that peace was not something given. It was something defended. One night after a storm passed, Eliza sat by the window and whispered, "What if someone comes?" Wianeto didn't flinch. "Then they'll come. And if they mean harm," he looked at her for a long moment, "then they'll leave." His tone was calm, but his eyes, they had the kind of stillness you only earned after surviving something unforgivable. She didn't ask what he meant, but she slept better that night. By April, the river had thawed. The sound of water returned to the valley, quiet but constant, like a memory you could live with. They walked down to the edge one morning, baskets in hand. Wianeto taught her to fish without a pole, just a line and hook and patience. She taught him to gut and clean without wasting a thing. Neither said what they were thinking. "We are building a life," Eliza began to sing again, this time not just inside the cabin. She sang while walking through the woods, while washing, while stirring pots that smelled like something worth staying for. Her voice was never strong, but it was steady. Wianeto never interrupted. But one morning she heard him humming, low and rough, in tune. They shared stories, slowly. He told her of a sister who used to braid his hair when they were children. She told him of a barn fire she started by accident at 8 years old and the whipping that followed. He told her of a winter where they had to eat the dog. She told him of the spring she almost married the wrong man, just to get away. Each story was a stitch. Each night, the fabric between them held tighter. She woke up one night from a dream she couldn't remember, sweating, breathing fast. Wianeto sat up before she spoke. "You're okay," he said. "I thought I was back," she whispered. "You're not." She looked at him, eyes raw. "I don't know how to love someone without losing myself." He nodded once. "I don't know how to be loved without hiding." They didn't touch, but they didn't look away either. And somehow that was more intimate than anything her marriage had ever given her. The next morning she found a small wooden bird carved and left on her stool. Its wings outstretched, its face turned toward the window. She held it in her hands for a long time. Then quietly she said, "I'm not running anymore." He was at the fire turning the kettle. "I know." They didn't kiss that day. They didn't fall into each other like people do in stories. Instead, he took her hand while walking back from the river. Fingers tangled, no words, just warmth. And Eliza knew, love didn't have to be loud. It just had to last. That night she asked, "What happens if I stay?" Wianeto looked at her for a long time, then said, "You already have." The thaw had come, and with it, the silence shifted. It wasn't the quiet of survival anymore. It was the hush before a question, before an answer. They were sitting outside the cabin, boots in the dirt, backs against the logs. The sun was warm for once, warm enough that Eliza had rolled up her sleeves and Wianeto had removed his coat. They hadn't spoken in a while, but it wasn't awkward. The space between them had learned how to hold things unspoken. Still, she turned to him and said, "Why me?" Wianeto didn't flinch. "Why did you pull me out of the river?" she asked. A pause, then, "Because I couldn't watch you sink." "That's not what I meant." He looked at her then, fully. His eyes were steady, dark, and so tired. Eliza didn't press further, but she knew the real answer was still inside him, buried under years of smoke and thunder, and she knew he would tell her, eventually. They spent the next few days in a rhythm, not just of work, but of something blooming. A kind of laughter had started to sneak in, not loud, but real. She teased him about his stubbornness. He teased her about her singing voice. He carved her a spoon. She patched the elbow of his shirt. It was the language they had built together, software untranslatable, but strong enough to carry the weight of two broken paths. One evening, as the fire dimmed, she asked, "What did you lose?" He was quiet a long time, then said, "A brother." She waited. He added, "To soldiers, near the Brazos." Eliza's heart ached, not just for the loss, but for the fact that he had to carry it so alone. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head. "You didn't do it." But she heard the message behind his words. You didn't run from it either. The next morning she found him standing near the barn, holding something in his hands. It was a leather pouch. He handed it to her without speaking. Inside was a single bullet, blackened, burned. She looked up. "This?" Wianeto nodded. "They branded me as a raider, a killer, years ago, for fighting back." She turned the bullet over. "And were you?" He didn't answer, not with words, but he said, "I've done things that made me a ghost in 3 counties. Eliza took a breath. "And now?" He looked at her, barefoot, with sleeves rolled, soot still on her cheek from cooking. And he said, "Now I want to be seen." They stood in silence a long time. Then she leaned forward and, for the first time, kissed him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't desperate. It was steady, like water finding its way into stone. Later that night, as they lay near the fire, her head against his chest, Eliza whispered, "Would you tell me how it ended?" He stroked her hair once. "Which part?" "The part that made you leave everything." He sighed and told her. He told her about the ambush, how they came for him after he refused to join them, how they beat him and left him tied to a tree for 3 days, how he had to chew through the rope, how he went back. Not for revenge, he said, but to make sure they wouldn't hurt anyone else. Eliza didn't speak. She just listened. And when he finished, she asked, "Did you kill them?" A pause, then, "I made sure they wouldn't come back." That was all he said, and it was enough. She didn't fear him. Not anymore. Because the man who had done those things was not the man who sang to her in Lakota when he thought she was asleep. Not the man who carved spoons, or tended birds, or made space for her to breathe again. He wasn't just a man with a past. He was a man beyond it. Spring crept up the valley like forgiveness. The grass came back. So did the wildflowers. Eliza planted onions in an old crate. Wianeto built a fence to keep deer out. They didn't talk about leaving, because neither of them wanted to. And when they went into town, together, for the first time in months, heads turned. People whispered. But Wianeto held her hand anyway. And Eliza looked every single one of them in the eye. The cabin changed. It got a second chair, a small table, a mirror above the wash basin. One night, Wianeto came back with oil lamps and a tin of rose soap. He didn't explain. But when Eliza lit the lamps, she smiled like someone seeing home for the first time. Then one morning, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee, she asked, "What if they come back?" "The ones you scared off." Wianeto didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and handed her a folded note. She opened it. It was stained with soot. Scrawled across the top were 5 words. "Stay gone. This place is watched." And at the bottom, in blood, "W?" Eliza looked at him. "You left this?" He nodded. "To every one of them." She looked back down and smiled. That night, curled together in bedrolls they hadn't used in weeks, Eliza whispered, So they're really gone? Wianato looked at her with that half smile. They're not the kind who come back. Somewhere deep in the forest, a coyote howled, and Eliza said, "Good." The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the cabin. And they stayed, not just because it was safe, but because they had built something stronger than safety. They had built peace. Some say he was a ghost, others a vigilante, a man who never talked and never missed. But in the quiet part of the valley where the cabin still stands and the grass grows thick, folks say there was a woman who once ate snow and nearly drowned, and a man who wouldn't let her. They say he stayed silent because the world had never listened before, but he listened to her, and she answered with her life. Now, if you listen real close in that valley, some nights you'll hear a voice drifting out of the trees, singing something low and wordless. They live there still, they say, together. No rope, no fire, no debt, just two hearts, beaten and rebuilt. Do you believe some people choose silence not out of fear, but out of love? Would you have stayed? The year was 1885, and the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a pewter sky that promised snow. In the distance, a train's lonely whistle echoed through the mountain valleys, carrying with it the dreams and desperation of those brave enough, or desperate enough, to venture into the untamed wilderness of the American West. This is the story of a woman who lost everything she thought she wanted, only to discover everything she truly needed. It's a tale of courage born from necessity, of love found in the most unexpected places, and of the fierce determination that lives within the human heart when pushed to its very limits. Some journeys begin with careful planning and bright hopes. Others start with 17 cents, a crumpled letter, and the cold realization that the life you've been living was never really your own. Eleanor Rosewood's journey began with the latter, a fall from grace that would become the first step toward a freedom she never knew existed. In an age when women were expected to be seen and not heard, to submit and never question, Eleanor would discover that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply choosing to live on your own terms. Her story unfolds against the backdrop of Cedar Falls, a rough frontier town where survival demanded everything you had and gave back only what you earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination. The train's wheels screamed against the metal tracks like a wounded animal as Elena Rosewood pressed her face to the frost-covered window, watching her old life disappear into the gray October morning. Her fingers clutched the letter that had shattered her world, the paper soft and worn from being read 100 times. Each word burned into her memory like a brand. Our marriage was a mistake. Do not try to find me. You are no longer welcome in Philadelphia. V. Ashford, 17 cents. That's all she had left after buying the one-way ticket to nowhere. The other passengers whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes taking in her wrinkled traveling dress and red-rimmed eyes with the cruel satisfaction of those watching someone else's misfortune. A woman traveling alone could only mean one thing: scandal. "Next stop, Cedar Falls," the conductor called out, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade. End of the line, end of the line, how perfectly fitting. Elena gathered her small carpet bag, containing everything she owned in the world, and stepped onto the wooden platform. The November wind cut through her thin coat like ice, making her teeth chatter as she looked around at what would have to become home. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at. A handful of weathered buildings lined a dusty main street that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. The mountains rose around the valley like stone sentinels, their peaks already crowned with snow that caught the pale afternoon light. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, nothing like the manicured gardens and gas-lit streets of Philadelphia. Here, nature ruled with an iron fist, and humans survived only if they learned to bend without breaking. Her stomach growled loudly enough to draw stares from the few people on the platform. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time had become strange since Victor had thrown her out of their home, hours stretching like years while days passed in a blur of hurt and confusion. The general store sat at the corner of Main Street, its crooked sign reading Mills General Goods in faded paint. Elena pushed through the door, setting off a brass bell that announced her arrival to a thin man with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled. "Help you?" Jasper Mills asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather not help anyone, especially not a desperate-looking woman with city clothes and empty pockets. Elena's cheeks burned with shame, but desperation gave her courage. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work." Mills laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Work? Lady, do you see where you are? This ain't some fancy city where ladies play at having jobs. Women here either got husbands or they got nothing. Which one are you?" Before Elena could answer, the bell rang again. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor behind her, and she felt someone's presence like warmth at her back. "Mills, you got any of that good coffee left?" a deep voice asked. The voice sounded tired but kind, like distant thunder that promised rain to thirsty ground. "Sure do, Marcus. But I got me a situation here first." Mills nodded toward Elena like she was a problem that needed solving. "This lady wants work." Elena finally turned around. The man standing behind her was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and hands that spoke of hard, honest labor. His clothes were clean but mended, his boots worn but well cared for. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Storm gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "What kind of work?" he asked, looking directly at Elena, instead of talking around her like she was invisible. "Anything," Elena whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. "I can cook, clean, keep books. I learn quickly." Mills snorted. "She's got city written all over her, Marcus. Probably never worked a day in her life." The man, Marcus, ignored Mills completely. He studied Elena's face with the intensity of someone reading a fascinating book, seeing things others missed. "I'm Marcus Stone," he said quietly. "I run a ranch about 15 miles north of here. Just lost my housekeeper last month. Job comes with room and board, fair wages. Works hard but honest." Elena's heart leaped like a bird trying to escape a cage. "I'm Elena Rosewood, and yes, I'll take it." "Hold on there," Mills interrupted, his voice sharp with warning. "Marcus, you sure about this? That woman's running from something. Mark my words. Probably husband trouble." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Every person in this territory is running from something, Mills. Question is whether they're running towards something better or just running scared." He looked at Elena again. "Which one are you?" Elena thought about Victor's cold dismissal, about the Philadelphia mansion that had felt like a beautiful prison, about the so-called friends who had abandoned her the moment scandal touched her name. She thought about the wedding ring she'd sold for train fare and the future that stretched ahead like an empty page waiting to be written. "I'm running towards something better," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she meant it. Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. We'll leave in an hour. That enough time to get your things?" Elena held up her small bag. "This is everything I have." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Understanding, maybe, or compassion. She hoped it wasn't pity. As they left Mill's store and walked toward Marcus's wagon, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was fragile as spun glass and just as likely to shatter, but it was real. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she was moving towards something instead of just away from the wreckage of her old life. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying her toward an uncertain future. But as the buildings of Cedar Falls fell behind them and the vast Montana landscape opened ahead, Elena Rosewood felt the first stirrings of what it might mean to be truly free. The journey to Marcus Stone's ranch took them along a winding mountain road that climbed steadily through stands of towering pine and aspen trees whose golden leaves danced in the crisp autumn air. Elena had never seen country like this, wild and vast and empty of the sounds that had filled her Philadelphia life. No clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, no rumble of carriages, no constant hum of city voices. Here the only sounds were wind in the trees, the creak of wagon wheels, and the steady breathing of the horses. "You afraid of hard work?" Marcus asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I don't know," Elena answered honestly. "I've never done any." Marcus pulled the horses to a stop and turned to look at her. "Never done any hard work? Not ever." Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "My husband, my former husband, didn't believe wives should work. I spent my days reading, doing needlework, planning dinner parties, useless things. Reading isn't useless, Marcus said firmly. Can you do numbers, keep books? Yes, I managed all our household accounts. Good. My last housekeeper, Isabella, was hopeless with numbers. Nearly got me in trouble with the bank twice. Marcus clicked his tongue, and the horses started moving again. What about your family? Won't they worry when you don't come home? Elena stared at her hands folded in her lap. My parents died when I was 16. Victor was all the family I had. She looked up at the mountains, their peaks already touched with snow. He made sure I knew that, made sure I understood how grateful I should be. Grateful for what? For being chosen, for having a place, for not being alone. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Funny how quickly gratitude turns into a cage. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. My Isabella used to say that about her first marriage. Said her first husband made her feel like a pet he kept around for decoration. Isabella was your wife? Marcus's face changed, becoming both gentler and sadder at the same time. My wife. She died last spring. Elena felt her stomach drop. I'm sorry, I didn't know. No reason you should, Marcus said, pointing ahead where the road crested a hill. There's the ranch. The valley spread out below them like something from a dream. Rolling grassland crossed by a silver stream that caught the afternoon sunlight, dotted with cattle that looked like dark specks from this distance. In the center of it all stood a white farmhouse with a red roof, surrounded by barns and corrals, and a garden gone wild with late-season flowers. It's beautiful, Elena breathed. Isabella thought so too, Marcus said, his voice catching slightly. Said it looked like a place where good things could grow. They drove down into the valley as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The air smelled different here, clean and sharp, like pine needles and snow and something Elena couldn't name. Maybe possibility. As they got closer to the house, Elena could see it needed work. The porch sagged slightly on one side, paint peeled from the shutters, and the garden was a tangle of weeds and overgrown roses. But the bones were good. Solid walls, a straight roof, windows that would let in the morning light. House hasn't had a woman's touch in months, Marcus said, sounding embarrassed. I'm better with cattle than I am with cleaning. A big yellow dog came bounding around the corner of the house, barking and wagging his tail at the same time. That's Scout, Marcus said, climbing down from the wagon. He's friendly, but not too bright. Don't let him in the house or he'll eat everything, including the furniture. Elena climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride. Scout sniffed her hands and decided she was acceptable, giving her wet dog kisses that made her laugh, despite her nervousness. When did you last laugh? Marcus asked, watching her pet the dog. Elena stopped mid-laugh, surprised by the question. I don't remember. That's a shame. You have a nice laugh. The inside of the house was even more neglected than the outside. Dust covered every surface, dishes sat piled in the kitchen sink, and clothes lay scattered across chairs. It looked like a place where someone had given up trying. This was Isabella's domain, Marcus said, looking around the messy kitchen with sad eyes. I haven't known what to do with it since she died. Elena walked to the window over the kitchen sink and looked out at the garden. Even overgrown and wild, she could see the planning that had gone into it. Vegetables near the house for easy picking, herbs by the kitchen door, flowers arranged by color and height. She was a gardener, Elena said. Best in the territory, could grow anything anywhere. Said the secret was paying attention to what each plant needed instead of trying to make them all the same. Elena touched a dusty jar on the windowsill. It was filled with seeds, beans maybe, or squash. May I work in the garden when I have time? Marcus looked surprised. You know about gardening. No, but I'd like to learn. Elena picked up the seed jar and held it up to the light. Isabella was right. Different things need different care. Maybe that's true for people too. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Maybe it is. He showed her through the rest of the house, the front room with its big stone fireplace, the bedroom that would be hers, the little office where he kept his ranch records in complete chaos. Everything was covered in dust and neglect, but Elena could see the love that had once lived here. Isabella decorated it all, Marcus said as they climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. I wanted to buy everything new, but she said a house should grow around the people who live in it, not be imposed on them. Elena's room was small but bright, with windows facing east toward the mountains. A simple bed, a chest of drawers, a chair by the window, clean and spare, but somehow welcoming. There are quilts in the chest, Marcus said. Nights get cold up here, even in fall. After he left, Elena sat on the bed and tried to understand what had happened to her life. This morning she had been a homeless woman with 17 cents and no future. Now she had a job, a room, and something that felt almost like hope. She opened the chest and found quilts that smelled like lavender and sunshine. As she shook one out to put on the bed, a piece of paper fell to the floor. Elena picked it up and saw it was a note written in elegant handwriting. Welcome, whoever you are. This room has been waiting for someone who needs it. Be kind to Marcus. He's hurting more than he shows. The garden knows all the secrets if you listen. Isabella. Elena read the note 3 times before she understood. Isabella had left it for whoever came after her, like she had known someone would need this place, this room, this chance to start over. Outside her window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of roses. In the distance, she could hear Marcus calling the cattle home for the night, his voice carrying across the valley like a song. For the first time since Victor had thrown her away, Elena felt like she might belong somewhere. Dawn came with a rooster's crow that could wake the dead. Elena stumbled from bed, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress and the long wagon ride. Through her window, she could see Marcus already moving around the barn, a lantern in his hand creating a pool of golden light in the purple darkness. She dressed quickly and hurried to the kitchen, where coffee sat ready on the stove. Marcus must have made it before heading out to his morning chores. The thoughtfulness of the gesture warmed her more than the hot liquid itself. Elena, Marcus's voice carried across the yard. Come meet the ladies. She found him in the chicken coop, a structure that smelled of hay and something else she couldn't identify. Hens clucked and fluttered around his feet as he scattered grain from a bucket. Ladies, meet Elena, he announced solemnly. She's going to be gathering your eggs from now on, so you'd best behave yourselves. You talk to the chickens? Elena asked, amused despite her nervousness. Why not? They're good listeners and they never argue back, unlike some animals I could mention. He glanced toward the pasture where a magnificent black horse stood watching them, ears pricked forward as if he understood every word. That's Storm, Marcus said. Smartest horse I've ever known, but he's got opinions about everything. Isabella used to say he was more like a grumpy old man than a horse. Marcus showed her how to reach under the hens for eggs, warning her that some of the birds were broody and would peck at intruders. Her first attempt resulted in a sharp pain across her knuckles and an indignant squawk from a red hen who clearly considered the eggs her personal property. She got you good, Marcus observed, examining the scratch. That's Duchess. She's the boss around here, and she wants everyone to know it. Elena found herself laughing, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. When had she last laughed with Victor? She couldn't remember. The morning brought lesson after lesson. How to milk the 2 cows without getting kicked. How to pump water from the well without straining her back. How to feed the horses while keeping her fingers safely away from their teeth. Each task revealed how little she knew about the basic work of staying alive. In Philadelphia, servants had handled everything from cooking to cleaning to shopping. Elena's biggest daily decision had been which dress to wear to which social event. Don't look so defeated, Marcus said, finding her struggling with the butter churn after lunch. Nobody expects you to learn everything in one day. Ranch life is different from city life, but it's not harder, just different. I don't understand the difference, Elena admitted, her arms aching from the rhythmic motion of churning. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, considering her question. In the city, you depend on other people for everything. Out here, you depend on yourself, your family, and your neighbors. When something breaks, you fix it. When you're hungry, you cook. When winter comes, you'd better have enough food stored up to last until spring. What if you can't do something? What if you don't know how? Then you learn or you trade work with someone who does know. Mrs. Henderson down the valley makes the best bread in 3 counties, but she can't shoe a horse to save her life. So she trades loaves for horseshoeing, and everybody wins. Elena thought about this as she finally achieved something that might generously be called butter. In Philadelphia, if she'd needed something, she'd simply purchased it. The idea of trading skills and labor seemed both foreign and appealing. That afternoon, Marcus took her to meet the cattle up close. The massive animals proved surprisingly gentle, allowing her to approach and even touch their warm sides. A calf with white spots wandered over to investigate her skirts, its rough tongue nearly knocking her over when it decided to taste the fabric. "They're like big dogs," Elena marveled, stroking the calf's soft nose. "Don't let them hear you say that. They've got their pride." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Elena helped Marcus with the evening chores. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and her dress was stained with things she preferred not to identify. But she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of useful work. "You did well today," Marcus said as they walked back to the house together. "Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. Did you think I'd give up and demand to be taken back to town?" The thought crossed my mind. City ladies usually don't take to ranch life. Elena stopped walking and turned to face him in the gathering darkness. "I'm not a city lady anymore, Marcus. I don't know what I am yet, but I know what I'm not." He studied her face in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window. "What are you then?" "I'm a woman with blisters on her hands and dirt under her fingernails who managed to get 3 eggs from Duchess without losing any blood. That's more than I was yesterday." Marcus smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "That's a good start, Elena. That's a very good start." The weeks that followed brought new challenges and small victories. Elena learned to read the signs that meant a storm was coming, the way the horses grew restless, how the cattle gathered in sheltered spots, the particular smell in the air that promised snow. She mastered the art of keeping the kitchen fire burning all day, of planning meals that would stretch their supplies, of mending clothes with neat, careful stitches. More importantly, she learned to read Marcus. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was worried about money, how he stood a little straighter when he was proud of something, the careful way he spoke Isabella's name, like it was made of glass that might shatter if handled roughly. And Marcus learned to read Elena too. He noticed when she was trying too hard to prove herself, when the weight of learning everything at once threatened to overwhelm her. He discovered that she had a quick mind for numbers and an eye for detail that helped her spot problems he might have missed. "You're good at this," he said one evening as they reviewed the ranch's account books by lamplight. "You ask questions I wouldn't think to ask." "Like what?" "Like why we're spending so much on feed when we've got good pasture. Like whether it would be cheaper to buy a bull rather than paying stud fees every year." Marcus looked up from the ledger. Isabella was hopeless with numbers, good with everything else, but hopeless with numbers. Elena felt a warm glow of pride. In Philadelphia, her intelligence had been something to hide. Victor had made it clear that men didn't like wives who were too smart. Here, Marcus seemed to value her thoughts and opinions. 1 month after her arrival, Elena realized she hadn't thought about Victor in 3 whole days. When she did remember him, it was with a mixture of pity and gratitude. Pity for the man who had been too small to recognize what he had, and gratitude that his cruelty had forced her to discover her own strength. That night, as she lay in Isabella's bed under quilts that now smelled like her own lavender soap, Elena felt something she had never experienced before, the quiet contentment of being exactly where she belonged. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a rider whose expensive clothes and nervous manner marked him as someone unused to frontier life. Elena was hanging laundry when she saw him approach, and something about the way he avoided eye contact made her stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Rosewood?" he asked, though her name came out like a question. "I have a delivery for you." The envelope bore the seal of Ashford and Associates, Victor's law firm, and Elena's hands trembled as she broke the wax. The message inside was brief but devastating. "Elena, your disgraceful behavior has come to my attention. A wife's place is with her husband, not playing house with strange men in uncivilized territories. I am prepared to overlook your momentary madness if you return immediately. However, if you persist in this embarrassing charade, I will have no choice but to take legal action to protect both our reputations. The law is quite clear about a wife's obligations. V. Ashford. Elena read the letter twice before its full meaning sank in. Victor knew where she was. More than that, he was threatening legal action, and in 1885, the law gave husbands almost unlimited power over their wives. A woman could be forced to return to her husband regardless of her wishes, her feelings, or even her safety. She was still standing frozen in the yard when Marcus returned from checking the fence lines, Storm's hoofbeats announcing his approach. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, dismounting quickly. Elena handed him the letter without a word. She watched his face darken as he read, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. When did this arrive? Just now. A man brought it. Expensive clothes. City manner. He asked questions about the ranch, about you. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun. Victor knows where I am. He knows about you. Marcus folded the letter carefully, his movements controlled but dangerous. Let him come. This is Montana territory, not some drawing room in Philadelphia. Out here, a man's word means something, and so does a woman's right to choose her own path. But Elena had lived too long under Victor's control to share Marcus's confidence. She knew how persuasive her husband could be, how skillfully he wielded social pressure and legal threats. In Philadelphia, Victor Ashford was a man of influence, with connections that reached far beyond the city limits. You don't understand, she said quietly. Victor doesn't make idle threats. If he says he'll take legal action, he means it. And the law... She couldn't finish the sentence. The law treated women like property, and married women had even fewer rights than their unmarried sisters. That evening, they were interrupted during dinner by the sound of wagon wheels in the yard. Marcus rose immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Stay inside, he told Elena, but she followed him to the window instead. Three men climbed down from an elegant black carriage that looked absurdly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the tall figure in the expensive overcoat. Victor Ashford had come to take her home. He looked exactly as she remembered, impeccably dressed, perfectly groomed, radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to get exactly what he wanted. The two men with him were strangers, but their bearings suggested they were accustomed to enforcing Victor's will. Elena, darling, Victor called out, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Philadelphia society. I've come to take you home where you belong. Marcus stepped onto the porch, his presence solid and reassuring between Elena and the men who had come to claim her. The lady doesn't want to go with you. Victor's smile was cold as winter wind. I'm afraid what the lady wants is irrelevant, Mr. Stone. Elena is my wife, legally and morally bound to me, until death do us part. Surely even in this rustic environment, you understand the sanctity of marriage vows? I understand that vows work both ways, Marcus replied steadily. A husband has obligations too. Indeed he does, which is why I'm here to fulfill my obligation to protect my wife from making foolish decisions that will ruin her reputation permanently. Victor's gaze found Elena through the window, and his smile sharpened. Come out, my dear. Let's settle this like civilized people. Elena's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to walk outside. She would not cower behind Marcus like a frightened child. Whatever happened next, she would face it with dignity. Victor, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, I received your letter. Then you understand why I'm here. This little adventure has gone on long enough. You've made your point about being independent, but it's time to come home and be sensible. I am being sensible. For the first time in my life, I'm being completely sensible. Victor's pleasant mask slipped slightly. Elena, you're being ridiculous. Look around you. This place is barely civilized. You're living in sin with a man you barely know, doing manual labor like a common servant. Is this really what you want? To throw away everything we built together for this? We didn't build anything together, Victor. You built a life that suited you, and I was expected to be grateful for the privilege of decorating it. That's enough, Victor snapped, his facade cracking completely. I've been patient with your hysterics, but my patience has limits. You're coming home with me tonight, willingly or otherwise." "No," Elena said simply. "I'm not." Victor gestured to his companions, and Elena realized with growing horror that one of them wore a badge, a territorial marshal, here to enforce Victor's legal claim to his wayward wife. "Mrs. Ashford," the marshal said, his voice apologetic but firm, "I'm sorry, but the law's clear. A wife's place is with her husband. I have papers here authorizing me to escort you back to Philadelphia." Marcus stepped forward, his face dangerous. "What papers?" The marshal produced a leather folder thick with official-looking documents. "Writ of habeas corpus, signed by a federal judge. Mrs. Ashford is to be returned to her husband's custody immediately." Elena felt the world tilt sideways. She had known this moment might come, but the reality of it was more devastating than she had imagined. All her newfound strength, all her hard-won independence, meant nothing against the weight of laws written by men who viewed women as property to be owned and controlled. "I'll go," she said quietly, before Marcus could protest. "Just give me a few minutes to gather my things." "Elena." "No," Marcus said, but she could hear the defeat in his voice. He was a good man, an honorable man, but he couldn't fight the entire legal system of the United States. "It's all right," she told him, though nothing was all right and might never be all right again. "This isn't your fight." But as she turned toward the house, Marcus caught her arm. "Yes, it is," he said quietly. "It became my fight the day you chose to stay. And I'm not giving up without a fight." The determination in his voice sent a spark of hope through Elena's despair. Maybe the law was on Victor's side, but they were in Montana territory now, where different rules applied, where a person's worth was measured by their character rather than their connections, and where sometimes justice mattered more than legality. The battle for Elena's freedom was just beginning. The confrontation that would determine Elena's fate began at dawn the next morning, when the entire population of Cedar Falls seemed to converge on the Stone Creek Ranch. Word had spread overnight through the tight-knit community, the way news always traveled in small towns. And by sunrise, wagons and riders were arriving to witness what everyone understood would be more than just a legal dispute. This was a test of what kind of place they wanted Cedar Falls to be. Dr. Harrison arrived first, his medical bag in hand, claiming he needed to check on Elena's health, but really there to offer his support. Mrs. Henderson came with fresh bread and a fierce determination to speak her mind about men who abandoned their wives and then demanded their return. Even old Jake Morrison rode over, grumbling about the early hour but positioning himself squarely behind Marcus and Elena. Victor emerged from the hotel looking every inch the sophisticated Philadelphia gentleman, his legal papers clutched in one perfectly manicured hand. But Elena could see something in his eyes she had never noticed before: uncertainty. He had expected to collect his wayward wife like a piece of misplaced luggage, not to face an entire community that seemed prepared to challenge his claim. "This is ridiculous," Victor announced to the growing crowd. "This is a private matter between a husband and wife. These people have no business interfering." "Maybe not in Philadelphia," said a new voice from the back of the crowd. "But out here, we believe in giving people a chance to speak for themselves." Elena's heart leaped as she recognized the speaker, Judge William Carter, the territorial circuit judge who rode from town to town dispensing frontier justice. He was a man with silver hair and keen blue eyes, who had a reputation for fairness that stretched across 3 counties. "Your Honor," Victor said, immediately shifting into the smooth legal manner that had served him so well in Philadelphia courtrooms. "I have federal papers ordering the return of my wife. This is a simple matter of law." Judge Carter examined the documents with the careful attention of a man who had seen every legal trick attempted in his courtroom. "These papers seem to be in order," he said finally. "But I'm curious about something, Mr. Ashford. What exactly are you accusing your wife of? What crime has she committed that requires federal intervention?" Victor's confident smile faltered slightly. "Crime? She's committed no crime, Your Honor. She's simply confused, emotional. You know how women can be." A dangerous murmur ran through the crowd at those words. Elena noticed that several of the women present, strong frontier wives who had carved homes out of wilderness, looked ready to give Victor Ashford a demonstration of exactly how women could be. I see, Judge Carter said mildly. So you're asking me to use federal authority to force a woman to return to a marriage she apparently doesn't want to continue, based on your belief that she's too emotional to make her own decisions? The law clearly states, I know what the law states, Mr. Ashford. The question is whether justice is served by blindly following that law in this particular case. The judge turned to Elena. Mrs. Ashford, would you care to tell me why you left Philadelphia? Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as every eye in the crowd focused on her. In Philadelphia, she had never been allowed to speak for herself in any matter of importance. Men had always spoken for her, about her, around her, but never with her as an equal participant in her own life. Your Honor, she began, her voice shaking slightly, I left because my husband wrote me a letter telling me our marriage was a mistake and that I was no longer welcome in our home. He gave me $50 and told me to make arrangements for my future elsewhere. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the story Victor had been telling. Do you have this letter? Judge Carter asked. Elena's heart sank. No, Your Honor. I destroyed it. I was so hurt and angry. How convenient, Victor said smoothly. Your Honor, my wife has clearly fabricated this story to justify her abandonment of her marital duties. I never wrote any such letter. Perhaps not, Judge Carter said thoughtfully, but I find it interesting that you haven't denied the substance of what she's claiming. Did you or did you not ask your wife to leave your home? Victor's face flushed red. That was a temporary arrangement. Business pressures, you understand. Sometimes a man needs time to think. So you did tell her to leave? Temporarily. I never intended for her to run off to the wilderness like some kind of pioneer woman. Elena felt something spark inside her chest, a flame of anger that burned away her fear. You told me I was a disappointment, she said, her voice growing stronger. You said you regretted marrying me. You said I was boring and that you couldn't bear the sight of me anymore. You gave me money and told me to disappear from your life. Elena, you're being hysterical. I'm being honest. The words burst out of her with years of suppressed frustration behind them. For 8 years, I tried to be the perfect wife you wanted. I made myself smaller and quieter and more invisible every day, hoping that somehow I could earn your love. But nothing I did was ever enough, because the problem wasn't me. It was that you never wanted a wife. You wanted a decoration for your dining room. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Elena could feel their attention like a physical weight, but for the first time in her life, she didn't care what others thought. The truth was pouring out of her like water through a broken dam, and she couldn't stop it even if she wanted to. You want to talk about law and duty and marriage vows? She continued, turning to face Victor directly. What about your vows? What about your duty to love and cherish me? When did you last ask about my happiness? When did you last treat me as anything more than a burden you had to carry? Victor's face had gone white with rage. That's enough. Your Honor, my wife is clearly having some kind of breakdown. She needs proper medical care, not encouragement in these delusions. But Judge Carter was studying Elena with new interest. Mrs. Ashford, what do you want? If you could choose freely, what would you choose? Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her. Dr. Harrison nodding encouragingly, Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Marcus standing tall and steady behind her, like an anchor in a storm. These people had become her community, her chosen family, in a way that Philadelphia society never had. I want to stay here, she said simply. I want to continue building a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for someone else. I want to work with my hands and use my mind and make decisions about my own future. I want to be free. Freedom, Victor laughed bitterly. You call this freedom? Living in a shack, doing manual labor, degrading yourself with a man who's nothing more than a common rancher? Elena, you were meant for better things than this. I was meant for happiness, Elena replied, and I've found more happiness in 3 months here than I found in 8 years in Philadelphia. Judge Carter had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a man weighing lives in his hands. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of the territorial court. Mr. Ashford, your federal papers may be technically valid, but I have some concerns about their basis. You're asking me to force a woman to return to a marriage where she claims to have been emotionally abandoned and then physically ejected from her home. That doesn't sound like a marriage worth preserving. Your Honor, surely you can't take the word of an emotional woman over legal documents? I can, and I will, Judge Carter said firmly, especially when that woman's account is supported by your own admissions. You've confirmed that you did tell her to leave, that you did give her money to go away. A man can't abandon his wife and then claim abandonment when she takes him at his word. Victor's confident facade was cracking like ice in spring. This is preposterous. I have rights. Legal rights. You do indeed, but so does she. Judge Carter turned back to Elena. Mrs. Ashford, are you asking this court to grant you a divorce on the grounds of desertion and cruelty? Elena's heart stopped. In 1885, divorce was scandalous, difficult, and socially devastating for women. But it was also freedom. Yes, Your Honor, I am. The words rang out across the silent crowd like a bell tolling. Victor's face went from white to purple with rage. You can't be serious. Elena, think about what you're doing. You'll be ruined. No decent person will associate with a divorced woman. Then I'll associate with indecent people, Elena said calmly, the kind who judge others by their character rather than their legal status. Judge Carter smiled for the first time that morning. Mr. Ashford, I'm going to give you a choice. You can contest this divorce proceeding and drag both yourself and your wife through a lengthy legal battle that will expose all the intimate details of your marriage to public scrutiny. Or you can agree to an uncontested divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, allowing both of you to move forward with your lives. Victor looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, at the community that had clearly chosen Elena's side over his. His Philadelphia connections and legal maneuvering meant nothing here, where people valued substance over style and actions over appearances. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice tight with defeat and rage. Elena, you'll regret this. When winter comes and you're struggling to survive in this God-forsaken wilderness, remember that you chose this hardship over the comfort I offered you. I will remember, Elena said quietly, and I'll be grateful every day that I had the courage to choose myself over your version of comfort. Victor climbed back into his carriage without another word, his legal papers worthless as scrap in the face of frontier justice and community solidarity. As the elegant vehicle rolled away toward town, Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Judge Carter approached her with a gentle smile. Mrs. Ashford, or perhaps I should say, Miss Rosewood again. It will take a few weeks to process the paperwork, but you're free, legally and officially free. Elena burst into tears then, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Marcus stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, and she felt the solid warmth of his embrace anchor her to this new reality. What happens now, she asked when she could speak again. Marcus looked down at her with eyes full of love and possibility. Now you get to choose. You get to decide what kind of life you want to build and who you want to build it with. Elena looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, at the mountains that surrounded her chosen valley, at the man whose steady strength had helped her discover her own courage. I choose this, she said firmly. I choose all of this. 6 months later, on a perfect May morning, when the mountain wildflowers painted the valley in shades of purple and gold, Elena Rosewood became Elena Stone, in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to her first wedding. There was no cathedral with stained glass windows, no orchestra playing classical music, no society guests in expensive gowns judging every detail. Instead, there was sunshine and laughter, and the sweet smell of Isabella's garden in full bloom. A garden that Elena had spent the winter learning to tend with careful hands and patient love. The ceremony took place on the front porch of the ranch house, which Marcus had spent weeks repairing and painting until it looked fresh and welcoming. Dr. Harrison performed the service, having been ordained as a minister years earlier, when frontier communities needed men who could serve multiple roles. Mrs. Henderson had made Elena's dress, simple white cotton with blue ribbons that matched the color of the Montana sky. The only jewelry she wore was her mother's silver locket, the one precious thing that truly belonged to her. But the most beautiful part of the ceremony wasn't the setting or the dress or even the words they spoke to each other. It was the look in Marcus's eyes as he promised to love and cherish her, not as a possession to be owned, but as a partner to be treasured. When Elena spoke her own vows, promising to stand beside him as an equal in all things, she meant every word with a depth of conviction that surprised even her. The kiss that sealed their marriage tasted like hope and smelled like roses. When they broke apart, the small gathering of neighbors and friends erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountains and sent a flock of birds spiraling up into the endless blue sky. The reception was held in the barn, which the community had decorated with wildflowers and lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Mrs. Martinez brought her famous tamales, the Hendersons contributed fresh bread and butter, and old Jake Morrison surprised everyone by producing a fiddle and playing dance tunes with the skill of a much younger man. Elena danced with her new husband as the sun set behind the mountains, feeling lighter than air and more grounded than she had ever been. This was what marriage was supposed to feel like, not a cage or a performance, but a celebration of two people choosing to build something beautiful together. "Any regrets?" Marcus whispered in her ear as they swayed to the music. Elena thought about her old life in Philadelphia, with its empty luxury and suffocating expectations. She thought about Victor, probably remarried by now to some other woman who would learn to make herself small enough to fit in his narrow world. She thought about the path that had led her here, paved with heartbreak and rejection and 17 cents worth of desperation. "Only one," she said, smiling up at her husband. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to choose happiness over security." Their first year of marriage brought challenges that tested their partnership in ways neither had expected. A drought that summer withered half their crops and forced them to sell cattle earlier than planned. Elena's attempts at preserving vegetables resulted in several jars that exploded spectacularly in the root cellar, filling the house with the smell of fermented beets for weeks. Marcus caught pneumonia during a late blizzard and spent 2 weeks in bed, while Elena learned to handle the ranch work alone, her hands cracking from cold and her back aching from hauling water and feed. But they also had their triumphs. Elena's careful bookkeeping helped them secure a loan to improve their irrigation system. Her correspondence with agricultural colleges back east brought new ideas about crop rotation and soil conservation that increased their yields. Marcus taught her to ride storm, and by autumn she could check fence lines and herd cattle almost as well as any cowhand. More importantly, they learned to be married in the truest sense, not just sharing a name and a house, but creating a true partnership where decisions were made together and burdens were shared equally. When Elena suggested they build a small schoolhouse on their property to educate the scattered ranch children, Marcus not only agreed, but helped her write letters to the Territorial Education Department requesting books and supplies. The news that would change their lives forever came on a snowy February morning, delivered by Elena herself as she stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Marcus drink his morning coffee. "Marcus," she said softly, her hand resting on her still flat belly, "we're going to have a baby." The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, but neither of them noticed. Marcus crossed the room in 2 strides and swept Elena into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy with laughter and tears and joy. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Dr. Harrison confirmed it yesterday when I went to town for supplies." Elena touched her husband's face, memorizing the wonder in his eyes. "We're going to be parents, Marcus." They held each other in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by broken china and filled with dreams of the future they would build together. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. 8 months later, Sarah Isabella Stone made her entrance into the world during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and sent the cattle huddling together in the pasture. Elena labored for 12 hours with Mrs. Martinez coaching her through each contraction, while Marcus paced the kitchen like a caged wolf. When the baby's first cry filled the house, Marcus burst through the bedroom door, with tears streaming down his face. In Elena's arms, wrapped in one of Isabella's carefully preserved quilts, was the most perfect thing he had ever seen, a daughter with dark hair and lungs strong enough to announce her presence to the entire valley. "Sarah for new beginnings," Elena whispered, stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. And Isabella for the woman who prepared the way for all of this. Marcus sank into the chair beside the bed, his work-rough hands trembling as he touched his daughter's tiny fingers. When she wrapped her whole fist around his thumb, he looked like a man who had just been handed the keys to heaven. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to your world." The years that followed passed in a blur of sleepless nights and first steps, and the daily miracle of watching a tiny person become herself. Sarah was walking by 10 months, talking by 18 months, and asking questions that kept her parents on their toes from dawn to dusk. She had Elena's stubborn determination and Marcus's adventurous spirit, which made for some interesting days on the ranch. Elena learned to nurse a baby while reviewing account books, to cook dinner with a toddler clinging to her skirts, and to function on 3 hours of sleep as if it were perfectly normal. Marcus discovered that fatherhood meant having tiny clothes mixed in with the cattle equipment and finding toy horses in his saddlebags, but also a love so fierce it sometimes left him breathless. By Sarah's third birthday, the Stone Creek Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Elena's innovative approach to bookkeeping and marketing had opened new buyers for their cattle, while Marcus's reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock brought customers from hundreds of miles away. They had expanded the house to include a proper nursery and a parlor big enough for the neighbors who stopped by regularly, drawn by Elena's hospitality and the couple's willingness to help anyone in need. The morning that would prove how far Elena had traveled from her old life arrived on a Tuesday in September, when a familiar carriage rolled up their drive carrying a passenger Elena hadn't seen in 5 years. "Hello, sister," said a cultured voice from Philadelphia. "I've come to see if the rumors are true." Elena stood on her porch, holding Sarah on her hip, wearing a simple cotton dress she had sewn herself and boots that were scuffed from honest work. She looked at Victoria Rosewood, still perfectly dressed and perfectly proper and perfectly miserable, and felt nothing but compassion. "What rumors would those be?" Elena asked calmly. Victoria struggled with the words as if they tasted foreign in her mouth. "That you've actually made something of yourself out here in this wilderness. That you're happy." Elena looked around at the life she had built, the garden where vegetables grew in neat rows beside Isabella's climbing roses, the barn where her daughter would learn to ride, the husband who loved her for exactly who she was, the community that valued her contributions, the work that filled her days with purpose and satisfaction. "I am," she said simply. "I really am." Victoria stayed for 3 days, and Elena watched her sister discover what it meant to live in a place where worth was measured by contribution rather than connections, where neighbors helped each other without expecting anything in return, where children played in the dirt and no one worried about stained clothes. On the last morning, as Victoria prepared to leave, she pulled Elena aside with tears in her eyes. "I always thought you made a terrible mistake when you left Philadelphia," she said quietly. "I thought you'd thrown your life away for pride and stubbornness. But seeing you here, seeing what you've built, I think maybe I'm the one who made the mistake." "It's not too late," Elena said gently. "You could start over too if you wanted to. You could choose something different." But Victoria just shook her head, climbing back into her carriage with a sad smile. "I'm not as brave as you are, Elena. I never was." As the carriage disappeared down the mountain road, Elena felt a deep peace settle over her like a warm blanket. She had spent so many years trying to be the person other people want her to be that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be herself. Now standing in the afternoon sunshine with her daughter babbling happily in her arms and her husband whistling as he worked in the barn, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sarah fell asleep in Elena's lap and Marcus reached over to take her hand. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question he asked every year on their wedding anniversary. Elena looked at the life spread out before them, messy and imperfect, and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined when she had stepped off that train in Cedar Falls with 17 cents and a broken heart. "Only one," she said, smiling as a shooting star streaked across the darkening sky. "I regret that it took me so long to learn that the only approval I needed was my own." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, not a lonely sound, but the voice of the wild country calling to others of its kind, reminding them that home was wherever you chose to make it, and family was whoever you chose to love. In the end, Elena had learned that happiness wasn't something you found lying around waiting to be discovered. It was something you built with your own hands, one choice at a time, with courage enough to choose yourself and love enough to share that choice with others. And that was worth more than all the approval in the world. Thank you so much for joining Elena on her incredible journey from the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the wide open spaces of Montana territory. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most devastating setbacks can become the doorways to our greatest adventures. What did you think of Elena's transformation? Could you feel her growing stronger with each challenge she faced? I'd love to know which moment in her story resonated most with you. Was it when she first stood up to Victor, when she found her courage in Judge Carter's makeshift courtroom, or perhaps when she finally found the happiness she deserved with Marcus and little Sarah? Stories like Elena's show us that it's never too late to choose courage over comfort, authenticity over approval, and true love over mere security. Her journey from 17 cents and a broken heart to a life filled with purpose and joy proves that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you're truly worth. Please let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. Are you listening from a bustling city like Elena's Philadelphia? Or perhaps from wide open country like her Montana Valley? I always love connecting with listeners from around the world and hearing how these stories of courage and transformation speak to your own experiences. If Elena's story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more tales of brave souls who dared to rewrite their destinies. Sometimes we all need reminding that no matter how dark the moment, a new chapter can always begin with the simple decision to choose ourselves. Until next time, remember, your story is still being written and you hold the pen.